Hello, this is Tim Hunt. We are standing in front of the Vernon County Courthouse here today. In every small town, there are important institutions that a community depends on. The school board, the city hall, police department, and of course your local judicial system. In rural Wisconsin, like most of the country, the justice system is one of the most important institutions in a community. One of the key players in that system, of course, is your local judge. In Vernon County, they have been fortunate to have the same judge on the bench for 31 years, Judge Michael Rosborough. Paul Harvey once said, small towns, as well as large good people, outnumber the bad people 100 to 1. In big towns, it's the 100 who are nervous. In small towns, it's the 1. Judge Rosborough has been one of those people keeping an eye on that 1. We have had the good fortune here in the county to have the judge on the bench for 31 years. I've had the good fortune of watching him for about the last 15 years. There's an old saying that it's hard to define something that's good, but you'll know it when you see it. In this case, for me, it might be hard to define what a good judge is, but I know one when I see one. Judge Rosborough is retiring at the end of July. His replacement was elected in April. We sat down to talk with him recently, how he came to Vernon County, his work to help establish a public defender's office in this part of the state, the difference between big city justice and rural justice, and what he has learned from 31 years of sitting on the bench in Vernon County. Thank you, first of all, for taking the time to talk with us.
I'm glad to.
I do have some topics that I kind of want to get to, and some things that I've thought about over the years and watching you on the bench that I always thought about asking you, but you know, we'll just see where our conversation goes. But first, just give me an idea of where you grew up and how you ended up in Vernon County. And you know, you talked a little bit yesterday in the courtroom, in fact, about growing up in Elgin, Illinois,
right,
and being close to the state mental facility.
Right, the state mental hospital. In fact,
So you grew up in Illinois?
Yeah, I grew up near Elgin, Illinois, in a rural community. In many ways, it's the kind of population is not that much different than the population here in Vernon County, an agricultural community. I grew up not on a farm, but on a farmette that was the house where my father was born. That's where I was raised. I went to, at one point in my early years, to a 2-room, not a 1-room, but a 2-room schoolhouse, where in the 3rd grade, the teacher would work with one side of the room, and then we had a chance to do our written work while she worked with the other side of the room. And over in the corner was a bookcase full of little blue biographies of presidents and other famous people. And I tell people that I read, I think there for the first time, a little biography on Abraham Lincoln, who thereafter kind of became my historical hero, a man who people forget, I think sometimes, was a great lawyer and therefore, I think, a great president. And he kind of became my role model. I can't say that right then and there I decided I was going to become a lawyer, but eventually found my way after graduating from high school to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, where I met my wife and we married, and I graduated from undergraduate and law school. Didn't really have a strong idea of what I wanted to do. I think I was looking primarily at probably a small private practice like many of the lawyers in this area practice. But an opportunity came along for me to work for an outfit called the Office of the State Appellate Defender. This is during the, I'll use the phrase public defender revolution, when Gideon versus Wainwright had said that indigent defendants had a right to counsel under certain circumstances. So states were creating defender systems. And the state of Illinois had created a regional system to provide for representation for people at the appellate level. And there was an office in Mount Vernon, Illinois, which is about halfway between, I think, St. Louis and Indianapolis, north of Carbondale. And I applied in that office, and by golly, I got a job, and it was a job where you got a check every 2 weeks and had benefits, and that worked for my family situation and paying off some modest law school loans that I had at that time. So I started out in that office, and over a period of about 6 years became the lawyer in charge of that office. And along the way, there were some lawyers that I had worked with who had Wisconsin connections. One of them had gone to UW-Madison for law school. Another one, the guy who preceded me as being the head of the office, his wife's career had taken him up to Madison. So I had reached a point where I'd done enough appellate work. It was certainly interesting and challenging, but was looking for a different challenge. So I was inquiring about possible jobs in trial-level public defender systems in the upper Midwest. And that was in large part because our family had some sense of the quality of life in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota. And we had 2 children at that time, and wanted to move up here where the hunting and fishing was better, among other things. So an opportunity came along to go to work for the Wisconsin State Public Defender System that was just getting formed then, back in 1979. So in the winter of 1979, I'd been interviewed, offered a position in lacrosse, didn't know much about lacrosse, but we came up and checked it out, my wife and I did, and said, hey, this looks like a great place to live. So we took the job, moved up here, and then opened the trial level office of the state public defender in the basement of what was then the La Crosse County Courthouse. Not the current one, but the one before it, in the old nurses station. It was myself and Dale Pacell, who later went on to become a judge at a later time in La Crosse. And after 6 years there, I was beginning to sense that, again, it was time to maybe move on to something different. Public defender work is challenging and heavy caseloads, lots of clients, sometimes a frustration because you can't give the cases as much time as you would like. You probably heard people say in court, I don't want a public defender, I want a lawyer. In reality, to be very candid with you, the representation provided, at least here in Wisconsin, by public defenders is as good or better than what most people get if they do hire private counsel. There are, of course, if you will, high-powered criminal defense attorneys anybody can hire, but most people can't afford them. So the average person gets, in my opinion, outstanding representation from those offices, and we felt like we were doing that. But like I said, there's a burnout factor, and at a certain point you start to think, well, maybe I should look for something else. I wasn't looking to become a judge. It never really entered my mind. But in the spring of 1986, Walter Block decided I'm going to move on, and specifically talked to me about whether I might be interested in applying for the appointment. Tony Earl was governor at that time. And I said, well, gee, I don't know if I want to do it, but I'll never know what it would be if I don't do it, so I'll at least think about it. And other judges in La Crosse, like Peter Pappas and Dennis Monavon and Mike Mulroy, encouraged me to do it. And I did. I got appointed, got elected in a contested election the next spring, and the rest is history. So that's how I got here.
So who was that you ran against in the first
David
election?
Jenkins.
Okay.
Ran against me.
Okay.
And I think the outcome was a clear-cut, victory, if you will. It was a trying time because I essentially knew that I was putting myself out on a limb. It was almost inevitable that there would be someone who would run against me. That almost always happens when there's an appointment. There's usually a contested election for the first go-round in that situation. But yeah, I ran hard and I ran scared and was successful.
And how old were you then?
37.
So the
So
first
I'm
appointment
68 going on 69 now.
and so 31 years.
31 years on the bench, yeah.
Yeah.
And Walter Block, when he told me, you should, this is a great situation for you. He said, you can do this for 20 years. And I'd tell people, he was wrong. It's been 31.
So looking back now, did you know what you were getting into?
I don't think any lawyer, and I hear this all the time from new judges. I teach case management, and I'll do it one more time, at the Judicial College, which is a week-long training that all judges have to go through basically every 6 years, and all new judges have to go through in their first year on the bench. And every lawyer who becomes a judge says, I had no idea. And not necessarily in a negative way, but you'll hear from prosecutors who've said, gee, I thought I knew how to take a guilty plea. I'd watched judges do it for 10 years, and I didn't know how to do it. And Peter Pappas, I remember talking to him shortly after I became a judge, and he says, I wanted to call you and ask you after that first day you were on the bench, how did you feel? It really is not something that is readily describable, because somebody can go up there and put on a robe and sit on the bench not being the judge and look out and you get a different perspective of the room. But when you're up there and you are it, I've got this little cartoon on my door here that I use in my presentation at the Judicial College, and I got it from Jim Rice, the judge in Monroe County, who also was someone who encouraged me to become a judge. And basically, I may not quote this correctly. You can look when you go out the door, but it basically says that one judge saying to the other, when I'm at home, I don't really get any credit, but I go to the courthouse and get on the bench, and I am it. And that's not something said in an arrogant way, but you suddenly realize that they're all looking at you, and you have to figure this stuff out. The first couple weeks after I'd been on the bench, I had this ringing in my ears, and I thought maybe I had some health condition. Then I realized it was just from gritting my teeth, and I learned not to grit my teeth, and that went away.
So backing up a little bit, and you went to law school, and was there a moment where, you said you read about Abraham Lincoln, but was there a moment where you said, I want to be an attorney?
Yeah, that was probably about my second year in college, because I actually started out wanting to be a wildlife biologist, or I thought I did. Then I found out you had to take chemistry to do that. And the hard sciences, I could do them, but they weren't my shtick. So after the first year, I transferred to Illinois. I'd been admitted at both of the schools coming out of high school. And that was about the time I decided that I was going to do pre-law, and got into majors in sociology and political science, kind of a dual major, and then pursued the social sciences as a degree. And I should have mentioned on the Lincoln connection, when I was with the 5th District Office of the State Appellate Defender, we argued cases in the 5th Judicial or Appellate District of Illinois in, I think, what is one of 2 courthouses still operational today where Abraham Lincoln had actually argued cases. And that was another Lincoln connection that I always like to look back on. You did kind of follow in
the footsteps a little bit.
I did. I literally followed in his footsteps in that sense only.
So the moment that in college, then second year of college, where you said, I want to be an attorney.
Yeah.
Was there something that made you go toward that?
No, I mean it wasn't like there was one single epiphany or event. Or something of that nature. Just kind of it was a gradual process over time that said, yeah, I really think that this is something that I want to do, and this maybe sounds kind of corny, but I think there are some of us who are inclined towards getting in lines of work where we help other people, whether it be the medical profession, becoming a member of the religious community. In fact, that's kind of the triad, the ministry, the medical profession, and the law are viewed as calling sometimes, the phrase is used, and you feel almost called to do something like that. I had some sense of that at some point in my life.
And I've heard you refer to your work, in an appellate system.
Right.
And when you're on the bench, and maybe talk a little bit, how do you think that formed your decision making or makeup as far as being a judge? How did that
Yeah,
affect you?
I think that was a great foundation. It would have been for anybody who pursued the same career that I did, but I really developed my writing skills in that 6 years or so that I did appellate work. That's all I did is wrote briefs. Back then, big legal pads, writing them out in longhand and then giving them to a staff person who prepared them on what was then called a mag card typewriter. I don't know if you remember those, but that was kind of before computers. And one of the things judges are often told not to do is take cases under advisement and write decisions. And I've pushed against that, and I don't follow that edict because it's not hard for me to write a decision. For some people it's procrastination. They'll have a pile of cases to be decided. And in fact, because historically it's been a problem for judges are required to file a statement every month that says, I have no cases under advisement for longer than 90 days. And you can get extensions on that, but you have to then say, I've told the court administrator I've got a case that's under advisement but more than 90 days and I expect to get it out by the end of the month or something like that. And I've never had to say that I had anything under advisement for more than 90 days. And in fact, more often than not, if I do take a case under advisement, I write the decision in about 9 days at most. But now with the benefit of the computer, I can sit down, and even though I'm a two-fingered typist and probably always will be, I can plunk out a decision out of my head, basically. There's a format for it, and it's not a problem for me at all. And that was a good foundation for then becoming a trial lawyer as well, because you're viewing all these appellate records and you realize what lawyers don't do to make a proper record. And I get frustrated in court sometimes because they'll have lawyers who don't know how to do that. You mark something as an exhibit, then you show it to a witness, and you ask the witness, I'm showing you Exhibit 1. What is Exhibit 1? Well, Exhibit 1 is the statement that I wrote, or whatever it is. And then you've got a record. Then you admit it into evidence, that kind of thing. So that was a good foundation for becoming a trial lawyer, knowing what kind of issues there are in record making and things of that nature.
And maybe dealing with a particular population, folks that are, like you said, getting in the public defender system. How did that also have some effect on forming your opinions or judgment as far as appellate cases?
Well, a lot of the people I represented at that level were people convicted of very serious crimes. I sometimes, when I came up here to La Crosse, I used to kid Mike Mulroy. I said, you want to see some real criminals? Let's send some bus tickets down to East St. Louis and we'll send them up here. I used to represent people who, in the words of the old Johnny Cash song, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. Well, I represented people like that on appeal, a lot of homicide cases. In fact, the last case that we had, although I had a very small part in it before I left of significance, was a case that a lawyer by the name of Steve Hurley, who was the head of the office at the time, now a very well-known lawyer in Madison, was the lead attorney. We were successful in getting the Illinois death penalty at that time declared unconstitutional, and he, to his credit, parceled out little portions of the brief. The brief was about that thick, and I wrote one of the small sections. It wasn't a significant part of it, but that's indicative of the kind of cases we had and we're representing down here. And then you come up to southwestern Wisconsin, where certainly any community has criminal cases, but most of the cases, not all, but most of the cases kind of paled in comparison to the level of criminality that I was working with and the kind of people I was representing in the appellate office.
So 31 years on the bench. I don't know what the average career is for a judge.
I don't either.
But I'm guessing it's not usually that long. Maybe I'm wrong.
There are ones, I think the record may be like 38 years for length of time on the bench. One of my colleagues from this area, Mike Kirchman, I think may have been on the bench that long until he retired 5 or 6 years ago. Most of those judges that went before me who are of that length were county judges before the system turned over. Kent Houck was on the bench in Richland County for a lot of years. I don't know if it was as long as me or not. Yeah, there are some who are still there that have been there longer than I am. There's at least one that's retiring this year that up north that's been in a 2-judge county, I think, about as long as I have.
And in that time, did you ever face any other challengers running against you?
No.
Just
No.
in that first election?
Bud Twesme, who was the judge up in Trempealeau County, told me, he says, "You should tell the lawyers in your county you can run against me, but you better win." And, of course, he was kidding. And, I don't think the lawyers ever felt intimidated. But, it's not easy to run a judicial campaign. I think that the two candidates two good candidates who ran against each other this time around realized that a county like this is still the kind of county where you can have meaningful elections. There's a lot of conversations over the years about appointment versus election. But in a county like this, you still can get out and knock on doors and go to meetings and that kind of thing, go to public events and get your name out and become a judge that way.
In watching you, I've been here for almost 15 years. I think I've watched you, and just a couple of things I've noticed, and you get a sense of, and I think it's that way with attorneys too. You watch over a period of time, and you can get a sense of, well, what kind of an attorney are they? What kind of a judge are they? A couple of things I've noticed that I think probably make you a good judge, and one of them is that I've noticed there's times when you maybe have somebody come before you that's obviously frustrating. They've missed several court appearances. They've been in court numerous times for the same thing, and they're dragging their feet, and they're just not getting the picture of what's required of them. And you kind of get tough with them. And there's times when, and then somebody can come along in the next case, and it's somebody that's maybe the victim of something, and I've seen your temperament just completely shift at times from being really tough and then being very compassionate. Do you work on that, or is that something that's conscious for you? Or
there are times when
because I don't think I could do that.
There are times when I might be chewing on some lawyer, and I'm winking at one in the corner of the room, who's kind of going like this, it's just, we each have our own distinct personality. That's one of the things we talk about at the Judicial College, and we're born with a personality. You can hone it and fine-tune it maybe up until about kindergarten, then over life it may smooth off the edges here and there, but it's pretty much, you are what you are, And in fact, we have all the judges at the Judicial College. They didn't do it when I started out. They do now. Take one of these Kiersey-Bates personality inventories, and we figure out who the INTJs are and the ESP whatevers, and then there's a session where we talk to all the judges about where they fit on the chart and how judges have fitted over the years, that kind of thing. So, it's just whatever personality I have. And sometimes, I get annoyed, and there are times when I let people know that I am annoyed. And you identified one of the things that sometimes I feel I have to make a point with a defendant. These guys who come in and say, well, I know it was a month ago, but I didn't get around to trying to call the public defender until last Friday, and then my phone died, and blah, 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 and here we are again, And I'll lean on those guys sometimes a little bit and say, now, you got to take care of this, and if you can't get to court, there's a way we can get you to court. We can bring you over here from the jail, and it's just a way of trying to get, people to do what they're supposed to do, because we need to keep these cases moving.
Well, and I've been in some other courtrooms in the area over the years, and I know yours tends to move, and I know you make a conscious effort to do that, because an attorney puts something off, and then pretty soon you're sitting there, and it's almost a year later, and nothing's happened with the case.
Now, like I said, I teach case management at the Judicial College. We had the two judges, Kathy Foster from Waukesha, who's been a friend of mine for years when we were both chief judges, and I teach it last few years, and we bring two different perspectives. She brings a large county perspective, I bring the rural county perspective. And I am of the opinion, I get feedback, to the extent I get feedback from lawyers, is they appreciate the fact that we keep cases moving. Justice delayed is justice denied, justice rushed is justice crushed. You may have heard that. So we try to, strike a balance there. And one of the big things we teach all judges, and that I try to adhere to, is have a skepticism for requests for continuances, set deadlines, and stick to them. And we never rush anybody through a proceeding, but there comes a point where certain lawyers have learned to know that I don't want to ask again because I've asked too many times already, and I'm going to get quizzed on why we need to adjourn this again, and I'm going to have explanations, and if I don't, the judge is going to start to have smoke coming out of his ears a little bit. So, and that happens with me, and there are times when, I always tell this story. Years ago, when I was a much younger judge, around Christmas time, we had some kind of a hearing in the lower courtroom. Kathy Burrows was clerking it, and I'd gotten fed up with somebody, and I kind of let them know it, and then I, kind of regretted that I had said what I'd said or whatever. So after that hearing was over, I turned to Kathy and I said, maybe for Christmas I should ask Santa Claus for unlimited patience. And she looked at me and she said, "What would you want with that?" And that's kind of the feedback I'll get from lawyers sometimes. They'll have a cocktail party or something to talk about some other judge. Judge so-and-so, he's so wonderful because he lets everybody say whatever they want, and everybody gets to be heard at great length. And then there'll be a pause. Say, on the other hand, hearings in his court go on forever. And we had a hearing the other day that should have taken 2 hours, and it would have taken 2 hours in your court. It took him 2 days to get through this, and it cost everybody a lot of money, blah, 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 blah. So that's the other side of judging. Every judge sets out, I think, trying to become every lawyer's favorite judge, and it just doesn't work. What you have to do at some point is realize that once in a while you're going to have to tell the lawyers no.
And so I've seen you be tough like that, but I've also seen you be very compassionate. And especially in cases, I think, where I can think of some cases in the last couple of years where, especially cases involving, say, chemical dependency and sexual assault cases where there's victims and sometimes young people. And I've heard you talk a lot about, and you're always very open in those cases, it seems like, of bringing in family opinions or points of view. And I don't know if all judges do that. I've seen you, pull family members out of the gallery and have them come up and speak and tell me what you know about this person. And, outside of, a social worker's report or an attorney's opinion, asking people, I've heard you ask family members, well, what do you want me to do with this person? Can you talk a little bit about that, allowing that input?
We, in recent years, have come to talk about evidence-based decision-making. And I think that concept may be borrowed from the medical profession. And if you reduce it to its essence, it's nothing more than let's look at what we do and why we do it, and instead of doing what we always did, let's do what works instead. And I realized that the philosophy I think I brought to the bench, even though I didn't know what it was 31 years ago, basically was that philosophy. I remember kidding Dennis Montalban when he retired. I said, "Hey, Monty, how come," because now in lacrosse, they're doing a lot of this alternatives to incarceration stuff over the years. I said, how come when I was with the public defender's office, everybody had to get 90 days in jail, and now, 30 days is more than enough. I was kidding him, and he says, "Oh, well, you got to get reelected," he says. And there's some truth there. The public really hasn't caught on to this notion that evidence-based sentencing basically says that somebody's never been in jail before, and you think there's a need to put them in jail. You can put them in jail for about 2 or 3 days, and that's all you need to do. And why we're putting people in jail for 30, 60, 90 days, 6 months, 9 months sometimes, is because, to be candid, we're ticked off at them. There's another word I'd use that starts with a P, but I won't since we're recording this, not that it would be a big deal. But is that a reason to put somebody in jail just because you're ticked off at them? And if you put somebody in jail for 90 days and they have connections in the community, such as a job and family and all that, and that all goes away during that 90 days, what have you accomplished? So those are the kind of questions that I think judges are now asking themselves. We're trying to make evidence-based decisions. And as part of that, judges are getting some training in something called motivational interviewing, which is also a concept that you'll encounter now in the medical field. You know, if you go to your doctor 5 years ago and you were overweight, he'd tell you, why don't you lose some weight? Well, you won't get that conversation from your doctor in the modern era. You'll get a more motivating approach to that. And that's something that judges are encouraged to do in things like, especially in these treatment courts, like our sobriety court. I don't know if you ever watched the sobriety court when we've held sessions. We try to do that. And it's even reduced to kind of a technical requirement. The sobriety court would, treatment courts would say that with each of the participants, judge should have a conversation where I think there's something like 4 positive comments and the exchange should last for at least 2 minutes. So it's even reduced to those kinds of approaches. Now, whether you're able to do that in reality is a different thing. But it's just been my philosophy of sentencing that we should try to look at the positives and bring out the positives. And, you know, I think back to a seminar I went to when I was a very young lawyer before I became a judge. This was down in Illinois, and there was a public defender from Chicago, Jim Doherty, I believe his name was, an old grizzled World War II vet. And he said, you know, in representing your clients, you know, each of them is an individual who has a family that, you know, loves and supports them, regardless of what they may have done. They're people with hearts and souls, and they're human beings. And that's how I try to approach everybody in the court system. You know, there are people who are seriously flawed, and, you know, I've had to send people to prison for their entire lives as a result of what they've done. But they're still individual human beings, and you know, I think you've probably seen that over the years too. That you know, the public has this perception: this terrible person is selling drugs in the community. We should send them to prison for the rest of their life. You know, well, then you get them into court and you see it really is much different than that.
And being on the bench as long as you have, and a long legal career in other places, and you've got a real, when you're in that profession, you get a real up-close look at kind of the whole nature of humanity and how people are, and the good and the bad. And I've always wondered, you know, watching people in that long, do you think people have changed in your mind? Has society kind of changed? Or are people basically just the same and society has changed around them? The world, it's more that the world has changed.
I think it's more the latter. You know, people are people, and as I said, they all have their individual personalities, their wants and needs, and some people are better than others, and some people need to shape up, and some of the parents I see in family court drive me crazy because they're more interested in themselves and their children, and they don't realize it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yet there's this kind of wave right now of more chemical dependency. I mean, do you think that has increased?
I don't. It's hard to say. And I was listening to John Spears. I was glad to see that he and I agree on a lot of things. And one of them is that the real problem is alcohol. Alcohol, however, is legal, and just about everybody, drinks alcohol. And most of the people that wind up in the criminal justice system are there because of alcohol abuse, or use even, you know. So we tend to forget that. And the other two things that we forget about that have always been there, one is mental illness, and the other is domestic violence. So those three things are the reasons why most people get into the criminal justice system. The great frustration right now, particularly in this part of the state, is things like meth. And we always seem to be slightly behind the curve on these issues. Elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the state, it's opioids and heroin. But in this part of the state, as well as up in northern Wisconsin, to my knowledge, it's kind of like, goes around the edge here. It's suddenly all this methamphetamine. And I, at this point, don't understand completely why people do that. I've commented at some sentencings lately that it appears to me there's a part of the population who uses it kind of like alcohol, but to get high, to stay awake.
Self-medicate.
Well, no, I think it's just for, if I go home at the end of the day after a hard day and I have a beer, I suppose you could call that self-medicating, but it really is just, it takes the edge off and I relax and I, watch a ball game or something. But there are others who seem to be using this because they get a thrill out of it, or they're the kind of people who want to stay up for 2 nights in a row and listen to Metallica or whatever. And that's all fine, but they're thrill seekers. That's my opinion on the one end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, you have the people that are completely addicted to this stuff.
Yeah, so maybe the people that would have in the past used alcohol, except this is maybe even more addictive.
It seems to give them a different buzz. And obviously I haven't taken any of it, so I don't know what is the buzz that you get from it. I've compared it to taking Red Bull. I remember one time I'd been out turkey hunting a few days in a row and had to go to a meeting in Madison. I was really kind of, so I stop at Quick Trip, I get a cup of coffee and one of those things in a can, and I drank it, and I drank the coffee, and I was awake, but didn't really, have any reaction to it until later in the day when I tried to go to sleep, and I couldn't get to sleep because of the, the amount of whatever caffeine or whatever I had in my system.
And in there, some of the cases you had yesterday, the addiction issue and mental health, seems like those two things, and I've heard you talk to people about, you're 50-some years old and you've been in front of me, 8 times in the last 20 years, and it all goes back to this.
Yeah.
Are we doing enough for mental health? I heard you address the young lady yesterday. You have a mental health issue. I wish this wasn't the only solution, but this is all I have, so I have to send you to prison. Are we doing enough for mental health and addiction issues that, there's all these other issues that result for when you don't address them?
Right. No, we're not. And the problem is that people with addictions, people with mental health issues, nobody lobbies legislators for them. And legislators think in short term, in the course of what's the budget going to be for the next 2 years, not what are going to be the needs of the people, our population, maybe 20 years from now. Or at least it's hard to get them to think about those issues. And we do not put nearly enough resources into services for people who are mentally ill and can function in the community. And as a result of that, we see, in my opinion, far too many people on involuntary mental commitments where they are not being followed in the community, not being provided with the services that they need, and therefore we wind up giving them those services on an emergency basis, just like people with health care go to the emergency room for problems that people with health care would go see their regular physician or urgent care at a much cheaper rate. The same thing happens in the arena of mental health. And that system is barbaric and broken, in my opinion. And getting the legislature to do anything about it is very difficult.
In both those areas, money spent in that area would be cheaper than the system currently if you would put resources into it.
Right. Going back to this issue of incarceration, there was another piece on La Crosse television recently about the Justice Sanctions Program in La Crosse, and it was a favorable piece, but it talked about how, and you can come up with whatever numbers you want, that it costs $100, $125 a day to keep someone in jail or prison, and about $25 a day to have them in some kind of non-incarcerated program, non-incarceration program. And if you look at the results in terms of public safety and recidivism, there's no adverse impact on any of those rates. Perhaps even better results, although it's something people can argue about because we're talking about soft numbers, than putting people in jail and prison. So if somebody's in jail for a year, what, $36,000 maybe? Prison, same thing. Whereas it's 25% of that to create a program.
So you're talking about a system where somebody's before you and you can give them a prison sentence or a jail sentence as an alternative. Say, we have this program,
Right.
you agree to X, Y, Z, complete that program and your sentence is dismissed or reduced, or
Right.
having that tool available.
Yeah, and that's what we do with sobriety court. The impetus for programs like that, the problem in Vernon County is that we have a very large jail. And we have a very large jail because we only build a jail in Vernon County once every 100 years. I kidded about that. And I was part of the group when we talked about how big of a jail should we build. And it's almost impossible to predict what your jail needs are going to be going forward because of shifts in attitudes and populations, et cetera. So for a long time, as you know, the Vernon County was paying for its jail by taking in inmates from elsewhere, and I think they're still doing that to some extent, although it's no longer Monroe County inmates. I think it's maybe
State of Wisconsin.
state prisoners, or I don't quite know what the details are. But in those places where they have a lot of programming that I'm talking about, places like La Crosse, they have all that programming. So they have a wing in their jail they could open at great expense, and they don't want to open it. So instead they put it into alternative programming. And Monroe County is doing the same thing because even though they built a new jail, Monroe County, I've often said, one day years ago I heard cases here in Vernon County, and I'm assigned to cases in other counties, and I drove to Monroe County, which is part of, 25, 30 miles away. I felt like I'd driven 300 miles because the cases I was hearing there were so vastly more serious and different. And I'm not suggesting that, when you pass over on 27 into Cashton, that suddenly you're into a whole different world or country, but different communities have vastly different issues, and they have different issues over there than we do here. We don't realize how good we've got it sometimes. This is a very safe community. Crime levels are, we have our problems, but they're a lot lower than they are elsewhere.
Other programs that you've talked about over the years, like a restorative justice approach.
Right.
I know you've been an advocate at times. I think we had a program here for a while.
For a short time, yeah.
Yeah. But talk a little bit about those programs and why you think they could be effective.
Well, I have so many cases where the victim is very angry. Why did this person break into my house, for example, and steal my possessions? What was their thinking process? Why did they think that was right? Well, there's a benefit, in my opinion, to the victim in those kind of cases, and also to the defendant if the victim's willing to do it. If they sit down with a third party, an intermediary, if you will, a mediator, and talk about that in a room. And there's tremendous benefits to that. People who are victimized rightly feel victimized, violated. And sometimes it can be in a very significant way, like a homicide or a sexual assault, or it can be on the lesser end of the scale, like I just suggested, the victim who has something taken from them, their possessions. So I think programs like that are valuable if you can get them established. They're hard to establish because, again, there's no constituency that really argues for the funding for them. So they're relatively rare. But there are programs. There's a former Supreme Court Justice, Janine Geske, who runs a program out at, I think, Marquette University, and even goes into prisons and does those kinds of restorative justice situations, even with people who have been victims of homicides in their family, and talk to the perpetrator who's in prison about how they feel.
Somebody's obviously upset because, I lost my chainsaw or you took my chainsaw, but what really makes me mad is that you invaded my my
Right.
home.
Right.
And that's another issue I wanted to ask you about, because I've heard you comment about this on the bench, but a couple of things. Wisconsin is a state that has online court records, and I think you've been a part of that organization that
Yeah, I'm
posts
part of the
those.
CCAP steering committee.
Right,
Yeah.
and you know, I've heard people come into court wanting to have their records, expunged at some point, you know, if they successfully do whatever. Talk about posting those records online, how you feel about that. And there's been some attempts, I think, in the legislature to
Right.
change some of those to, you know, only felonies or anything that's dismissed is not there. So
That's a real quagmire, because there just isn't any good answer about any of that. And the legislature has provided that under certain circumstances, certain people can get their records expunged. It's usually for less serious nonviolent offenses. It used to be just for misdemeanors for people that were under, I think, the age of 21. It's been expanded now. There's a list. In fact, I don't know if this report that I'm looking at right here may even talk about a study that this particular group did of expunction or expungement in Wisconsin. But it's something that CCAP, which is a Consolidated Court Automation Program, has talked about literally for ever since we had CCAP, because CCAP is a public record. Anybody can go to it. We don't charge for it. And find, you know, I can run my wife's name through and see if she got a traffic ticket if I want to. So it's there, and it's readily accessible. And unfortunately, it can be, I reluctantly use the word abused, because people, I think, don't want to give people a second chance and rely on it too much. An example would be, to get away from the criminal thing for a moment, evictions. If you are on record as having been evicted, and you're a low-income person, good luck trying to find someone who will ever rent to you again because of the fact that you were evicted. And you may have been evicted for good cause, but there may be other facts behind that that are no longer present. You know, you may now be well employed and all that kind of thing, and you still can't get somebody to rent to you.
Or you may have been charged with a misdemeanor, disorderly conduct or something, and charged with it. If the case was dismissed, there was nothing to it, but it's still there on record.
It's still on your record. And, you know, you'd be surprised the people that you will encounter that, I know I have been on a couple of boards, one of them being the Head Start board for many years. And we were recently interviewing someone for employment, which we did in fact hire, but during the interview he said, I got to disclose to you I had this, you know, minor conviction, youthful mistake. It still shows up. Now I'm in my 30s, and I just wanted to be upfront about it, you know, and it didn't change our decision whether or not to hire that individual. But, you know, those things are out there now, and they haunt you.
And the other part I've heard you talk about was privacy issues. I actually heard you make the statement one time, I think, that, well, you know, forget about privacy. There's no such thing.
Privacy's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've said that, and I'm not the first person who said that.
Do you think that's a good thing, bad thing? It doesn't really matter?
I think it is what it is. You know, I always say about technology that I'm neither a tech geek nor a Luddite, that for every 2 steps forward with technology, it's 1 step backwards. But that's just the way it is. You know, when the automobile came along, the world changed, and it continues to change. And you can, whether it's progress sometimes is debatable, you know, but you can't stop the advance of our civilization for what it is.
And that has an effect on the legal system too.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
We've had a president now that's kind of been attacking even beyond just being critical, but, you know,
Right.
kind of questioning the authority even of the judicial system. What are your thoughts? Have you been paying attention to that? Or?
Yeah, I think all judges are, and I believe it was the recently confirmed Justice Gorsuch who himself commented on that he indicated that he was not pleased by the attack on the judiciary, because, you know, we as judges, because of ethical limitations, and I'm not complaining about it. You know, we really can't defend ourselves or our profession, our calling. We have to rely on others to do that. And you know, I've been aware of situations over the years where I've never really felt this that happened to me, but that other judges were unfairly criticized in the public for decisions that they made. And many years ago, there were a couple of times when there were some efforts to recall judges for what they had done and or not done, or what they'd said or not said. And we all have to answer ultimately to our professional code of ethics. And you know, judges for the most part in Wisconsin. I'm very proud to have been a Wisconsin judge for all these years, because I know judges around the state, both current and past, and they're a very honorable, well-educated group, and I've gotten to know judges around the nation, and the judges, in my opinion, in general in Wisconsin are as good as judges anywhere. Now, I think what happens in the future will be interesting and of concern, because like all state employees, judges were adversely affected by Act 10. And you know, I make less money now than I did 6-8 years ago. And there's some modest proposals this year to give judges some raises, but I think what I was reading was that judges in Wisconsin are like 38th in the country in terms of what we're paying judges. And I don't know that it has yet affected the quality of the people who are willing to do this, or how long they're going to stick around, but there could come a point where it will.
Well, that's why I was kind of surprised to hear you say that, you know, you feel that the quality of the justice system in Wisconsin is very high.
Yes.
Because I did recently see that information that I think we're in a public defender's office, you said you think people you deal with those people on a constant basis, so
and the prosecutors.
To hear you say they get, you know, they get good representation there, because I think they were paying $40 or $50 an hour for a public defender.
Yeah, that's the private bar, and that's one of the biggest problems, is that the public defenders themselves will have conflicts of interest where they can't hear certain cases, and they need people on their private bar lists, and those lists are extremely short. And there are some good lawyers on there, but there are lawyers on there that really aren't of the highest quality, with all due respect to them. And that's a problem with seeing that people get competent representation.
I think it was the lowest paid
Yeah.
people in the country.
Yeah.
When they go to that list.
There's what is called the Supreme Court rate, which is $70 an hour, and that's what we pay guardians ad litem, for example, that we appoint in cases involving children in the family court and juvenile and children's court. But that hasn't changed in 40 years either. And that, I think, probably $70 an hour about covers their overhead. The difference is that when we appoint someone at $70 an hour, they know they're going to get paid. Whereas if a client hires them at $150 an hour or $200 an hour, whatever lawyers charge in this area, and I really can't say, they may get a retainer, but once that retainer is used up, they may not be collectible, let's put it that way, particularly it seems like in criminal cases and family law cases, lawyers sometimes have trouble actually getting paid beyond a retainer. I know I've talked to some of our judges who have come out of small practices in our communities in this part of the state, and I've heard them say, one of the things I don't miss is trying to collect my fees as a small town sole practitioner or 2 or 3 law office situation.
Looking back on, I mean, I'm sure it's difficult at times. You have a lot of touchy cases and a lot of hard decisions to make. What's some of the more difficult decisions you've had to make in terms of sentencing or anything else?
I always say there's 2 things that I will not miss if I never have to do them again, and that's to decide to send someone to prison in a case where there's a good argument that it should be either probation or prison, you know, in a close case. And the other is deciding who gets the kids in these divorce situations. Those are just terrible decisions to have to make because they have tremendous effect on people's lives.
And there's another one maybe that you could comment on, which is I've seen cases where you've had somebody that's had numerous OWIs and they've made all the right statements about, I've turned my life around, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And the balance between, do I give them another shot? And then, I can think of a case in a neighboring county here not too long ago where a young lady went out after being given another chance and killed a father, and those have to be difficult choices too.
Yeah, you sometimes live with the consequences of the decisions that you make. There's a case I always cite down in Grant County. They have a sobriety court much similar to ours in terms of how it operates, and I know that one of the graduates there did exactly what you just said, went out and drove drunk and killed somebody thereafter. So, but you just have to accept that people have to be responsible for their own actions, that you make the best decision you can on the information before you try to reach a result that's both factually based, first of all, then just and fair. And those three things are all in some ways a little bit different. And you just have to accept that people are going to be people. And I always remember a case about a domestic abuse injunction that I had years ago over in Hillsborough, where I did what I was supposed to do. I granted the injunction, and the husband's guns were to be taken away from him. He thereafter got a gun and killed both himself and his wife. And I cite that case sometimes when people are arguing in front of me about whether an injunction should be issued, and I say, hey, look, when push comes to shove, I remember that case, and I'm going to err on the side of caution and find that there's grounds for an injunction. And I realized that, as the old Dixie Chicks song, he walked right through that injunction. There's only so much you can do with a piece of paper. About Earl, yeah, you remember those kind of things, and they stay with you.
Well, I thank you for your time. What are you going to do with your time now? More duck hunting?
I'm not a duck hunter. I couldn't eat those things. I am a turkey hunter, and a deer hunter, and I'm not hardcore. But I have a grandson who's 12, and he's getting into these things, and so we do some 3-generational hunting. We built a new home in retirement, and my wife, for example, this weekend we've got raised garden beds to fill with dirt.
You've got a list.
Oh yeah, and that list will keep me busy, and we'll do some travel. We have a teardrop camper that's been gathering dust for the last couple of years, and we'll get out and do some of that stuff.
You used to bring your dog to work.
I did, and she passed away.
She did? How long ago?
Oh, this was, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. Brenna. In fact, on my bench, there's a framed photograph of her that says the Honorable Brenna Rosborough. And when I get a little annoyed with someone, I just look at that. And she's my, even though she's no longer with us, she's my therapy. My wife and I had a Boston Terrier who we also recently passed away. So now we're dogless. And I think we'll probably stay that way. We miss the dogs, but they also are issues when you want to travel and things like that.
How many years did you bring her to work with you?
Oh, she was 16 when she passed, and I probably brought her to work for 14 years. Yeah, yeah. I had a little dust up with the county board about that, but you know how that came out. So you know who prevailed there.
You can classify her as a service dog.
That's right, and and that's what staff would say over in the clerk's office. I remember Sheila one time saying, sometimes, and one of the great things about being judge here is we have great staff. You get the cream of the crop from the community because there's only so many jobs of that nature. So Sheila said to me, sometimes I'll have a difficult person at the window and I just get kind of tense, and then I just pet Brenna and I feel better. And I was kind of on the forefront of that because now service dogs, especially for kids who come to court, are very common in courthouses now, that they train dogs to do that. And, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for your time.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it very much.